A leading figure from Minnesota's territory days through its early statehood is Henry Hastings Sibley, the state's first governor. Brian Pease of the Minnesota Historical Society tells us more. Henry Sibley played a significant role in Minnesota history. He served as the territory's first representative in Congress. Of the territory of Minnesota, he was Minnesota's first governor. He helped frame the state's constitution, and he had a good relationship with the Dakota people when he worked in fur trading. How did Henry Sibley come to call Minnesota home?
He started out as a young man coming to Minnesota as a representative of the American Fur Company. He was 23 years old when he was given the responsibility to be kind of the representative of the headquarters for that fur company in Minnesota. And so he built a house in the 1830s eventually across from historic Fort Snelling, and really became an iconic figure for not only the people that were coming in to visit what would have been Minnesota at that time, and also had a strong relationship with a lot of the native people, especially the Dakota people that he was working with to get the furs back into his company.
Henry Sibley had a relationship with a native woman, and that produced a daughter. Her name was Helen. His work also with fur trading dealt with a lot of Native American people. How did those relationships influence his views?
Well, I think he was living in both worlds because his customers were the Dakota people, or anyone else that was bringing in the supplies and the goods that he wanted, especially the fur. And so he would spend time with a lot of Dakota people out hunting, going on expeditions. He's pretty well known for his relationship with the Dakota people. In fact, his nickname was Walker in the Pines. And so they accepted him as almost one of them. But of course, as more people move into colonize or take over the land, you have to divide your loyalty to, well, I'm a white person, so I want to talk more about the influences I have with that population, because the Dakota people or other native people, they're important, but they're not. By the 1840s and 50s, the fur companies are kind of losing their popularity. Fur companies are losing business. And so it's like we kind of have to move on from that chapter into the next chapter of Minnesota's history.
This part of the United States was undergoing great change. What did the territory look like in 1851, about a decade after the failure of the American Fur Company?
It was expanding rapidly. You have the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, which Henry Sibley had a vested interest in. A lot of the Dakota, by the time of those treaties in 1851, were in incredible debt to the American fur companies. And so as these treaties take place, the traders are insisting that they get a payment of that treaty to pay off those existing debts. And so that, complicates some of the interactions he had with Dakota leaders, because they felt they were being cheated out of some of their money. But you have to look at this idea that people are progressing. And so either you're progressing with this or you're part of the problem. And so Dakota people were in the way. So we have to take that, buy that land, purchase that land, and put them on reservations. And then hopefully they become acculturated and become part of our civilization. And that leads to a lot of resistance, obviously, because people are not always willing to bend to the will of a greater power, or a group of people saying you have to be this way.
Sibley was sworn in as governor in May of 1858, just days after the state officially became a state. What were some of his accomplishments as governor?
Not a lot, in the sense of 2 years isn't a lot of time. That was the standard until all the way up to the 1960s. Governors only served 2-year terms. And so he was elected in October of 1857, so he didn't quite have 2 full years, but he was one of those governors that was faced with all kinds of economic hardships within the new territory and the new state of Minnesota. So he ended up that first year as a governor with a $5 million loan debacle, which was the constitutional creators decided in the Constitution the state can only borrow $250,000. So you can't lend out more than $250,000. Well, they wanted these railroads so badly in Minnesota to help the prosperity and the progress that they decided to change the Constitution just months after it was adopted by the citizens of the new state of Minnesota. So they got the legislature to, make that Constitution amendment pass. The public voted for it to pass. And so they started trying to give out these certificates to these railroad companies, which at the same time there was an economic panic, one of the great panics of American history, where everything, all the investments that were brought into Minnesota got sucked out almost immediately. So the bottom line was they gave these companies these loans for $5 million and only a few miles of railroad were ever built. So that was a debt we had to pay off until the 1880s. And so that really strapped Sibley as a governor, trying to kind of rectify that horrible situation. So what happened as a result of that is his political opponents kind of tried to paint him into a corner that he was at fault for all these kind of hindrances to Minnesota's progress, and he was actually against it. And so he was even fighting, releasing these bonds to these companies, but the court overruled him. And so that's kind of his legacy as the $5 million loan. But you can credit him. We have our L'Etoile du Nord, our Star of the North symbol, and our state motto. That's something that he created, with the idea that we can be a guiding light for other states to follow. So as for accomplishments, there really was a lot he was able to do in that 2-year time period.
Both Henry Sibley and Alexander Ramsey ran for governor for the first, gubernatorial election. Henry Sibley won. How did that impact their relationship?
When Alexander Ramsey was the first territorial governor, when he came to Minnesota, he had no place to stay. So Henry Sibley invited him to stay at his house until they could find a place for him to live in St. Paul. And so they were political, antagonists for many, many years. In fact, that first state election for governor, Sibley and Ramsey were competing against each other, and Sibley only won by 240 votes. So it was a really close election. And there's, of course, allegations of fraud and that type of stuff, and probably was. But it's one of those things where I thought, they were political opponents, but I think they had a relationship, a friendship. In fact, when the U.S.-Dakota War began, Alexander Ramsey came to Henry Sibley's house and said, "I need you to lead these troops because you're the most skilled at working with these Dakota people, because you had engaged and interacted with them for decades. And so we need you to help put down this war that's taken place in Minnesota." Eventually, they were able to end the war. Chief Little Crow at that time was pushed out, and his followers left with him. But as part of that conversation of what do we do with the people who were considered peaceful or really didn't have a role in that, they were put in at a camp at Fort Snelling, basically a concentration camp, and some people say an internment camp, just because by virtue of that war taking place, they were going to abrogate their treaty. They're basically saying, you did all these bad things, now you can no longer live here. So they were exiled from the state of Minnesota eventually. So he was a proponent of that. He was a proponent when they did these military trials of hanging over 300 men that were part of those battles, or alleged, people who were killing people, white people in particular. And so, he was, I think, part of the idea that justice has to be served, and based on what I've heard, these people are guilty, even though historians have argued since those days that the trials that were conducted for the Dakota people were not fair, and it's pretty evident that that was the case. But he was in that situation of people were asking for justice in Minnesota. We have 600, and at that time they thought it was 1,000 people killed, and it's like, where's the justice? Somebody has to pay the penalty for all these deaths. And so that's kind of the emotion that was generating throughout the state of Minnesota. Someone has to pay for that. And so the Dakota men that were found guilty were the best choice for that opportunity for frontier justice. But the other part, Lincoln weighed in and said, a lot of these guys were just participants in battles, so why would I execute them? There's no reason to do that. So that's where they, from the 303, deemed of capital crimes, that list was pared down to 38. And so and unfortunately for Minnesota, that's the largest mass execution in U.S. history in our state, and that was in 1862. So.
Much of Henry Sibley's contributions were made outside of public office, but are they still significant?
Oh, absolutely. You know, he was the first territorial delegate in 1851 for the Minnesota Territory. He was an early founder of, you know, our state, basically one of those guys who was part of the Constitutional Convention. So, you know, he got his political experience in the 1850s up until, you know, after, you know, politically he was pretty much done after 1860, but he was a member of the community of St. Paul. He was the president of the St. Paul Gas Company. He was, you know, the part of the Board of Regents for the U of M. So yeah, I think his legacy was, part of it was he was one of those first people here, first European American, Anglo-American people here. So he kind of paved the road for what would happen in Minnesota in the future, just because of his, you know, working with the Dakota people, being an important part of kind of the political atmosphere in the early history. And so I think that tends to be romanticized. And you always think of all these great accomplishments that he did have, and we can't take that away from him. He did have these accomplishments, but like we've talked about, you know, there's always good and bads. And so he's really a man of that time where he has to make decisions, tough decisions. You know, how do I best operate my business and still treat people fairly? And so, you know, the way I look at it, he saw everything as either, you know, there's a sense of justice, and if something isn't, you know, the way it should be for justice sake, there has to be something that remedies that. And obviously that's where the trials and all those decisions were made about the Dakota people. But it's one of those things where it's hard for him, I think, you know, or even us today, to look at, and we can see all the bad things, but there was also a lot of the accomplishments as well.